تل الربيع. شوف تم تسميتها تل الربيع بعد احتلال يافا. كانت يافا هون فصارت تل الربيع.
تهانية لك يا مروان، رحت على يافا وشفتها وانبسطت فيها. بس أصدقائي بحكي لكم يعني يافا أكيد مش يافا وبس، يافا وحيفا وعكا والناصرة وكل المدن الفلسطينية اللي احتلت بال 48 رح ترجع لنا بيوم أصدقائي الأطفال.
والله يا مسافر شعلاني هالغيرة، فلسطين بلادي حلوية ما شاء الله، مي العصا قد حول عطبرية، لا عكا وحيفا اللي مع بحرها، لا تنسى الناصري هالقلعة العربية، بشر بيسان برجعة أهلها.
اوعي تعتقدي انه في واحد فلسطيني سواء اللي بيقول بحل الدولتين او اللي بيقول غير ذلك انه ممكن ان يوافق على انه هذه المستوطنات ان تكون جزءا من اسرائيل، وحيفا ويافا وعكا مش فلسطينيه. لا، حيفا ويافا وعكا والناصرة فلسطينية غصبا عن الامريكان وغصبا عن الاسرائيليين.
لكن نحن في مدارسنا نعلم ما يمليه علينا ديننا وضميرنا بان القدس هي عربيه، وان فلسطين من شمالها لجنوبها من نهرها لبحرها هي عربيه فلسطينيه اسلاميه، وستبقى كذلك رغم انف هذا المحتل البعيد.
هي اسرائيل، هي ارضنا.
اسرائيل ارضنا، ارض 42.
هي ارضنا، هي فلسطين المحتله.
48
ارضنا فلسطين المحتله، برافو عليك. هي حيفا يافا عكا، هي اراضينا المحتله، اراضي 48 اللي احتلتها اسرائيل ب 48 احتلتها اسرائيل ب 48 هي اراضي فلسطينيه، رح تضلها فلسطينيه، وان شاء الله رح ترجع لنا بيوم وتبطل تحت سيطره الاحتلال.
For several decades now, politicians, clerics and school teachers living in the areas known as the Gaza Strip, the West Bank and East Jerusalem have been teaching their children, teenagers and young adults that the whole of the land of Israel in fact belongs to the Arab people who are today known as the Palestinians. This claim is widely propagated throughout the Palestinian media and education system and further afield in Muslim-dominated countries in the Middle East. The claim goes on to assert that the Jewish people have no historic connection with Jerusalem and that they are in fact trying to Judaize the holy city and that the Jewish presence there is illegal. Moreover, this claim is now becoming widely believed among many in the Western world. So what historic and legal claim do the Palestinian Arabs have over Jerusalem and the land of Israel? Jewish writings dating back over 2,000 years, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, confirm there was a historic Jewish presence here in Jerusalem well before the time of Christ. Archaeological sites such as this confirm that fact. Christian records confirm that a Jewish temple stood up there on what the Palestinians call Haram al-Sharif, or the Temple Mount, at the time of Christ. Jewish historical records show that Jerusalem was in fact the capital city of the people of Israel 1,000 years before Christ. Extra-biblical records, for example, what is known as the Cyrus Cylinder from the ancient Persian Empire, which is now housed in the British Museum, confirm that King Cyrus gave permission for the Jews to return to their capital city, Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple that had been destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. These stone steps date back to the time of King Herod, and there are many other examples of Herodian structures across the Middle East. Even Islamic sources, such as this publication dating back to 1924, when the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was in charge of the Haram al-Sharif in the British Mandate period, acknowledges that there had once been a Jewish temple standing here, and these steps, these stone steps, lead up to it. In the year 70 AD, the Romans destroyed not only the temple, but the entire Jewish capital was destroyed too. The historian Josephus Flavius records that more than 1 million inhabitants of Jerusalem were killed, and the rest were taken off to Rome as slaves. So how did the Jewish homeland, the land of Israel, come to be known as Palestine?
Palestine is not even the original name of the land that is denominated Palestinian land. Palestine is not a Hebrew word, it's not an Arab word, it's a Roman word. That land was originally Eretz Israel. It took the name of Palestine under later occupations.
The original name is Plishtim from the Bible, or Philistines. But they were in the coastal area, basically nothing to do with the name Palestine. Palestine was reused as Palestine as we know it today by Hadrian when he occupied the country in 135 following the Bar Kokhba revolt. He really wanted that the Judea will be forgotten. And that is the main reason why he changed the name to Palestina, to Palestine.
The final Jewish rebellion against Rome in the early 2nd century, known as the Bar Kokhba uprising, was brutally quashed by the Romans. Jews were barred from entering their ancient capital city, Jerusalem, until the 4th century. Even though most Jews had either been killed by the Romans or exiled and taken off as slaves, there were small Jewish communities scattered across other parts of the Jewish homeland.
If it had not been for the diaspora, the vast majority of the population would have been Jewish. It was Christian before the Muslim armies invaded, and gradually over the years, the Jews had gone mostly to Europe. Some had stayed behind and always been in Jewish prisons.
For example, there was a continuous Jewish community living in Hebron from the time of the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC until the British expelled them in 1929. Other Jewish communities thrived for many centuries in places like Tiberias and Safed in the Galilee. From the 4th century onwards, the land that had been renamed as Palestine by the Romans was under the domination of the Byzantine Empire when the Cardo here was built. This was the main thoroughfare through Byzantine Jerusalem. Jews throughout the empire were regarded as second-class citizens, including in Palestine, which was part of the province of Syria.
There's no real Arab connection until the 7th century, maybe a little bit before that with the Nabateans. But basically what happens is in the 7th century, starting in just a couple of years after the death of Muhammad in 632, then Arab armies come in and they conquer the whole of Syria. They go on to conquer most of the rest of the known world at the time.
The invading Arabs brought with them a new religion, Islam, and the Byzantine Empire started to go into decline. By the Middle Ages, a Jewish community had been firmly re-established here in Jerusalem. Historical records show that there were massacres of both Jews and Muslims here during the Crusades. From the early 16th century, Palestine was ruled by the Ottoman Turkish Empire. It was the Ottoman Sultan, who was known as Suleiman the Magnificent, who rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem as we see them today. At its zenith, the Islamic Ottoman Empire dominated the whole of southeastern Europe, as well as much of North Africa and the Middle East. However, by the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire was well in decline and had become dependent on trade with European powers such as France, Germany, and Great Britain, and also Russia for its economic survival. With this economic dependence came increasing influence by the European powers, especially when it came to the treatment of non-Turkish, non-Muslim minorities within the Ottoman Empire.
Britain in 1839 began to establish a diplomatic relationship with the Turks, and this was part of a process of reforms in the 1800s called the Tanzimat. Very, very important to understand this, because the Tanzimat basically gave to the European powers certain conditions. It was already there from the capitulations, but now the Europeans were saying, we want more autonomy for the minority groups. Now, under Islam, the minority groups were known as the dhimmi subjects, whether they were Christians of various denominations and Jewish people, Armenians, for instance, under Islam, and the Jewish people at the bottom of the ladder.
Remember, the Ottomans were an empire built for many people, different everywhere. If they give any kind of autonomy, independence to one people, then the others would come and demand it. To say the Ottomans were not treating the Jewish people very well, they didn't treat anybody very well, as a matter of fact.
Great Britain was the first Western nation to establish a consulate in Jerusalem. The reason given for their presence here was for the protection of the Jewish people, which by the 1840s was the largest single ethnic group in Jerusalem. For many years, in the mid-19th century, the British consulate was located adjacent to the first Protestant church to be established in the Middle East, right here within the Christ Church compound inside the Jaffa Gate. Today, what was the consul's residence and office is the Christ Church Rectory. It was also here at Christ Church in 1865 that the Palestine Exploration Fund, under the patronage of Queen Victoria, established its Middle East headquarters.
In the 1870s, at the beginning of the 1870s, it was decided that a proper map of Palestine of that time, or the Holy Land, needed to be made. So the end result of this project, which lasted from 1871 all the way through to 1878, was that you had this map of the entire country, 1 inch to the scale. You also had a set of memoirs listing all of the archaeological sites which were visited and with the discoveries which were made there. But also they provided a lot of information about the land as a whole, in terms of, for instance, those areas where you had forests, those areas which were utilized for agricultural purposes. Also in terms of the population of the time. They really provided us with a very detailed picture of the demography of the land, who lived there, and what were the differences in terms of those inhabitants within given villages and towns, Christians, Muslim and Jews. And I think this is very important in terms of our understanding of what the land looked like, its general appearance, and who were living in that land in the 1870s.
Before the Mandate, these were all countries living under the Ottoman rule, this Turkish rule. People are just holding land that is actually owned by Turkish landlords.
Lands here were centered in late 19th century in hands of big effendis. Almost all these villages there were neglected. They were almost uninhabited villages. And if they were inhabited, they were around the valley, not in the valley itself, and very small, very, very neglected villages.
If you look at the historical evidence, they're very poor countries. They're very unsuccessful. They're very underpopulated. This is particularly true of parts of southern Syria. Deeply underpopulated. They're not glamorous, wonderful, happy places at all.
If we talk about the whole population in Eretz Israel, 1800 about, estimation 200,000, 1830 250,000, 1905 500,000, WW1 600,000, perhaps 650. 1922, the first Mandat census, 673. These are the numbers, not more than that.
Looking at Jerusalem, at the beginning of the 19th century, there were, let's say, about 2,000 Jews in Jerusalem. we can see that by the 1840s, the Jews in Jerusalem was already a majority congregation in the city, because there was about 4,000 Jews and 3,000 Muslims and 2,500 Christians. All the population of Jerusalem were living within the city walls.
For over 20 centuries, the city of Jerusalem was almost completely composed of or limited to the old city. If you look at Jerusalem in the 1st century and the 5th century, all the way up to the 19th century, Jerusalem was the old city. There was very little outside the walls.
In 1863, British Consul James Finn, who was living here inside the Jaffa Gate, conducted a census of the inhabitants of Jerusalem. The figures were published the following year. Out of a total population of 15,000, 8,000 were Jewish. The other 7,000 were made up of Muslims and Christians. So by then, Jerusalem had a Jewish majority population. In the mid-19th century, Jewish philanthropist Sir Moses Montefiore was given permission to purchase land outside the city walls, which paved the way for the expansion of the city of Jerusalem.
The cornerstone for Mishkenot Sha'ananim was laid in 1851, and it was in 1853 that Montefiore actually imported the windmill here. In Mishkenot Sha'ananim, the construction was completed in 1861.
And we have neighborhoods, straight after Mishkenot Sha'ananim and Machane Israel. We find Nachalat Shiva in 1869, and Beit David in 1873, and Mea Sharim 1874. But really the push leaving the old city walls was really, I would say, the pushing forces that started to create this movement.
So to sum up, the city of Jerusalem up to the mid-19th century was contained entirely within the city walls. There was no West Jerusalem or East Jerusalem in those days. There had been a resident Jewish community continually here since the Middle Ages at least. And by the 1860s, the historic records show the overall majority of the population of Jerusalem was Jewish. When you look at the eyewitness accounts of people who travelled to the Holy Land in the 19th century, they speak of a land that was both desolate and sparsely populated. The surveys undertaken by the Palestine Exploration Fund in the 1870s confirm that. There is absolutely no historic record of an Arab people who called themselves the Palestinians, let alone a Palestinian Arab entity whose capital city was Jerusalem. Palestine then was not a nation or even a state. It was an area of the Ottoman Empire ruled from Constantinople, also known as the province of southern Syria. Yes, it is true that the majority of Western Palestine's sparse population was ethnically Arab, many of whose ancestors originally came here with the Islamic occupation that began in the 7th century AD. But the historic fact is that the territory known as Palestine has never, since the name Palestine was first applied by the Romans, been an Arab nation or designated to be an Arab nation. In other words, historically, an Arab nation known as Palestine never existed.
I think that the study of history, I would say this as an historian, wouldn't I? But nonetheless, I think the study of history is tremendously important when it comes to the understanding of why Israel is Israel. If we were taught a bit more about the Ottoman Empire, a bit more about the rise of nationhood and nationalism, a bit more about the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the whole of the creation of the idea of the State of Israel after the First World War as well as before it, people would understand that this isn't a 1947-1948 construct at all.
In the 1880s, the balance of Palestine's sparse population began to change, with a significant influx of Jews fleeing from the pogroms in Russia. Increasing anti-Semitism in Europe saw the birth of the Zionist movement led by Theodor Herzl, whose aim was to bring about the formation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Although Herzl never lived to see his dream fulfilled, the First World War brought the beginning of its realization. At the same time, an Arab nationalist movement within the Ottoman Empire was beginning to emerge.
This was Arab nationalism. It was Arabs against the Turks. It was Arabs wherever they were living, but particularly in the Middle East. I mean, when you go beyond into North Africa, you have some Arabs, you have Berbers and so on as well. But so this was very Arab nationalism. Nobody had any thoughts of Palestinian nationalism at that time whatever, because there was no such place as a state of Palestine. There never had been. So nobody had gone for generations thinking, I'm a Palestinian.
At the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, the Turkish Ottoman Empire sided with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany against France, Russia, and the British Empire. Great Britain, together with her allies from Australia, New Zealand, and troops from across the British Empire, fought against the Turks, who were backed by the Germans. As the war on the Eastern Front progressed, both the British and French governments started to consider how the Ottoman Empire would be divided up in the event of its defeat. Where would the aspirations of the Zionist movement fit into it? And where would the Arab nationalist movement fit into it? In 1915, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, entered into correspondence with Sharif Hussein of Mecca.
Letters were exchanged between representatives of the British government and Arab leaders, more specifically the Hashemites in Arabia. These letters, referred to as the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, involved commitments by the British to support a movement that would lead to the independence of Arab states. There's no doubt that these commitments were made. There were question marks as to the scope of the commitments. But these letters were not public. They were private, confidential exchanges between the British and the Arabs.
The deal with Sharif Hussein had no legal validity. It was just only exchange of letters. In order to make it legally valid, you have to make a contract, you have to make a deal, you have to make an agreement by both parties. Here it was just an exchange of letters without inconclusive correspondence, and more disagreements than agreements, actually.
McMahon himself made it perfectly clear. First is in a letter to John Shuckburgh, he wrote about this that it was fully my intention to exclude Palestine as it was to exclude the more northern coastal tracts of Syria. And he's talking about two parts of Syria, and he wanted to exclude the southern part. Even later, that was in 1922, 1937, he wrote a letter to the Times, and he said, I felt it my duty to state, and I do so definitely and emphatically, that it was not intended by me in giving this pledge to King Hussein to include Palestine in the area in which Arab independence was promised. I also had every reason to believe, at the time, that the fact that Palestine was not included in my pledge was well understood by King Hussein. Now, you can argue against that, but can you really argue against the man who wrote the letter?
And then, in 1960, there were other commitments, this time made between the British, the French, and the Russians. These agreements referred to as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And they decided to allocate and distribute rights in respect to the very same territories. None of them had the power of disposition in international law. So it's important to know that these agreements were made the Sykes-Picot in particular was a secret agreement, and that it had an impact later on the borders of what became Palestine and the borders of Lebanon and in Syria, because the French always reminded the British of the prior agreements, but they were not binding legal instruments in international law.
In late 1916, the Allied forces, known as the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, were nearing El Arish and the border with Palestine, thus ensuring a sufficient buffer zone against any further Turkish and German aggression against the Suez Canal. By this time, a new Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary took office. David Lloyd George and Lord Arthur Balfour replaced Asquith and Grey. Both came into power and both of them wanted to take the land of Israel. They wanted to make a big buffer zone to make sure that in the future no rival European power was ever going to come in and cut or thwart Britain's link from herself, from Britain, through to the Eastern Empire.
The military campaign to capture Palestine from the Turks that continued through 1917 was beleaguered by one defeat after another. At home, the British government was considering the aspirations of the Zionist movement, which led to the Balfour Declaration.
The Balfour Declaration is truly a defining moment of history. Why? Because a number of years earlier, the Zionist movement, which took off as a result of the initiatives of Herzl, first his very important document under the name of the Jewish State, where he was looking for a solution to the Jewish problem. This document really is the beginning of the story. To understand the importance of the Balfour Declaration, we've got to go back to him. And his proposal, his solution was, we need to end the homelessness of the Jews. We need a home. We need a state. And then he had this conference in Basel, Switzerland in 1897, brought together 200 prominent Jews from around the world and did something rather miraculous. He got them to unite. The history in Europe of what the Jewish people went through is horrendous. It is persecution, it is massacres, pogroms, expulsion from countries. It take a long time to even summarize what the Jewish people went through. And there were leaders in Great Britain who were courageous and were prepared to make a decision which was a noble decision, because it was time to act justly. It was time to repair these wrongs. When the British government, with the help and support of the United States, of France, of Italy, decided that we're going to uphold and support this policy regarding the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, everything changed.
On the 31st of October 1917, as the War Cabinet met here in Whitehall to decide the final wording of what became known as the Balfour Declaration, unbeknown to them at that moment, the Allies won their first victory in the campaign to liberate Palestine from the Turks. Earlier that day, the British and New Zealand forces paved the way for the epic charge of the Australian Light Horse to take the historic town of Beersheba. It was one of the last horse-mounted charges in the history of warfare. The news of the victory in Beersheba reached London on the day that the letter from Lord Balfour to Lord Rothschild was signed on the 2nd of November 1917.
His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done...
The fall of Beersheba into Allied control paved the way for the conquest of Jerusalem and to bring the ancient Jewish homeland under British rule. A year later, on 31st of October 1918, the Turkish Ottoman Empire surrendered to the Allies. The surrender of the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire followed shortly after that. After the end of World War I, in November 1918, a peace conference was convened in Paris in early 1919. The Balfour Declaration, which had the full support of the Allied powers, was a pledge to facilitate the formation of a Jewish national home in Palestine. However, at the time, it was merely a political statement with no legal authority. Contrary to popular belief today, the Balfour Declaration also had support from Arab leaders at the time. In January 1919, Chaim Weizmann, the leader of the Zionist organization, met with one of the sons of Sharif Hussein, the Emir Faisal of the Arab Kingdom of Hejaz.
They were looking for each other's support in respect to their national aspirations. Their discussions resulted in the signing of an agreement, which is often overlooked. And there are several provisions in this agreement which was signed on January 3, 1919, which make it clear that Palestine is supposed to be the territory for the Jews. In fact, the third article of that agreement specifically mentions the policy of the Balfour Declaration in respect to Palestine. There is no doubt that the spirit and the letter of this agreement relates to a Jewish home in Palestine and a very significant independent Arab state in other parts of the Ottoman Empire.
This is Le Salon de l'Horloge, the room where the opening sessions of the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 took place at the French Foreign Ministry in Le Quai d'Orsay. Later sessions took place at the Palace of Versailles, which resulted in the Treaty of Versailles. That settlement, or treaty, became legally binding for the nations in Europe who had taken part in the First World War. Not only did the Paris Peace Conference deal with the European theatre, but also with the territories that had been ruled by the former Ottoman Empire. The Supreme Council of the principal Allied powers invited both Arab and Jewish representatives to present their territorial claims in this room.
It was on February 6, 1919, that the Arab delegation presented its claim to the principal Allied powers in Paris. Interestingly, the British delegation was represented by Prime Minister Lord George and Lord Balfour, who was the Foreign Secretary. The representative, the Emir Faisal, specified where the Arabs wanted to establish independent Arab states. What's very important is to note that in describing the territory where the Arabs would have their autonomy and their independence, he left Palestine out. He refers to Palestine. So at this moment in February of 1919, he's complying with the commitments that he made in the agreement signed with Chaim Weizmann in early January of 1919. Having described where the new Arab states should be, he says this: Palestine, for its universal character, he wants to leave to the side for the mutual consideration of all parties interested. So he's acknowledging that Palestine is not to be part of the new independent Arab states.
3 weeks later, on the 27th of February 1919, Chaim Weizmann and the Zionist organization presented their claim
When the Zionist organization presented its claim, it also specified the scope of the territory that they were asking for. They presented a map. It was a map of Palestine showing that all of the areas that were located west of the Jordan River should be part of the new Jewish state, or the new Jewish national home, and the part that was on the east side of the Jordan River. They were asking for areas that were all full of historical connections and biblical significance. And if you look at the many maps that exist of the allocations and distribution of land to the 12 tribes of Israel, everything that was allotted to these 12 tribes was covered by these maps. But the area they were asking for stopped before the Hejaz Railway, which went from north to south, all the way to the boundaries of Arabia, because that was an important and strategic railway for those who attended pilgrimages in that part of the world.
The Supreme Council of the principal Allied powers adjourned the consideration of future dispositions in the former Ottoman Empire until after the League of Nations had been constituted, which also happened at the Paris Peace Conference. At the end of the war, American President Woodrow Wilson had strongly opposed the idea of imperial and colonial expansionism resulting from victory.
Previously, if a state in a legitimate war conquered another state, it had the right of annexation and generally did exercise that right of annexation or set up some sort of colonial government but retained sovereignty to itself. Because of the pressure from President Wilson, Britain and France could no longer claim to annex it.
One of the things that not so well known about the mandate system is that it was essentially a compromise between the United States, initially under Wilson, who believed that World War I should have brought the imperial age to a close. That was the American view, that it is the time of self-determination of peoples. That is the idea that Wilson introduced at the end of World War I, and therefore the imperial age should come to a close.
This is a statue of Jan Christian Smuts, which stands opposite the Houses of Parliament in London. Smuts was a member of the War Cabinet that decided on the final wording of the Balfour Declaration on 31st of October 1917. He was also one of the founding fathers of the League of Nations and a co-author of the Covenant of the League. The mandate system originated from Article 22 of the Covenant, which gave the mandatory powers a sacred trust of civilization to administer a people or a nation to a situation where they would be capable of both self-determination and self-government.
The sacred trust of civilization means, in this case, one country being entrusted with the administration of a nation that is not yet ready for self-government is a sacred trust, not just for that one nation, but a sacred trust of all civilization, meaning entrusted on behalf of the League of Nations and all of humanity.
In 1917, Lord Allenby conquered the Holy Land, and the Jews were promised a national home in Palestine by the Earl of Balfour, a policy endorsed by Woodrow Wilson and by the League of Nations, which made Palestine a British mandate.
San Remo, the Villa de Vachon. This is the place where legal rights were granted. This is the place where legal rights were given to both the Jewish people and the Arab people.
Dr. Jacques Gauthier is an international human rights lawyer. For more than 30 years, his focus has been the legal status of the old city of Jerusalem under international law, which was the subject of his doctoral thesis. He describes the significance of the decisions made at the San Remo conference in April 1920.
It's in this place that the leaders with the power to make binding dispositions with respect to the Ottoman territories, deliberated and made the decision, having heard claims from the Zionist organization in Paris in 1919 during the Paris Peace Conference, having heard submissions from the Arab delegation in respect to what they wanted in the Ottoman territories. Having heard these submissions, a group of them gathered here and made final binding decisions in international law as to who would get what.
What mandates did, what the whole institution of mandates was about, was a way of guaranteeing self-determination of peoples. It was really the first time that international law created and recognized this right.
It was the Jewish people that were chosen to be the beneficiaries of a trust, a mandate under the care of the British government in respect to Palestine. It was the Arab inhabitants of the territories of Mesopotamia, Iraq now, Syria and Lebanon that were chosen to be the beneficiaries of a trust or a mandate. Part of it under the trusteeship of or mandate of the French, Syria and Lebanon, part of it under British supervision, Mesopotamia.
The Supreme Council of the principal Allied and Associated Powers that met here at the Villa Devashan in April 1920 was made up of 5 nations: Great Britain, France, Italy, Japan and the United States, which as an associated power was present as an observer. The British delegation was led by Prime Minister David Lloyd George.
San Remo, from the legal point of view, is the major link between the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which was a promise, but it wasn't a legal commitment, it wasn't a legal document, it's a vital historic document, but San Remo turned it into an international commitment.
The difference is that these powers now can give rights to others. They do have the power of disposition. They receive it in treaties, such as the Treaty of Sèvres of August 1920, and later the Treaty of Lausanne of 1923. In these treaties, they are specifically granted title. So it is vital to understand that this power of disposition that was required in international law to be able to grant rights, it is obtained by these 5 powers and then conveyed subsequently to the Jewish people and to the Arabs. During the San Remo Conference, as the representatives of the powers are trying to determine the scope of the territory to be covered by the mandate for Palestine, the scope of the territory to be the location of the national home of the Jewish people, the question is asked, what should Palestine be? Lord George refers to a specific map from a famous geographer, an expert in the Middle East, in Palestine. George Adam Smith refers to map 34, which is a map which depicts the kingdoms of David and Solomon, areas on the west side of the Jordan River, east side of the Jordan River. He then explains to the French representative, Millerand, that we must give the territories from Dan to Beersheba to the Jewish people if we are going to recognize properly their claim to the historical connection with the Jewish people. Also, you find a multitude of communities, of villages, of cities in the area that we would describe today as the West Bank or the disputed territories. The recognition was given that there was a connection between the Jews and these communities. It's also very interesting to note that if we look at the map, of course, at the center of it is Jerusalem.
The San Remo Resolution of April 1920 was later unanimously endorsed by all 51 countries of the League of Nations. It was a watershed moment in the history of the Jewish people, who had been exiled from their national home for almost 2,000 years. Referring to the San Remo Resolution, Chaim Weizmann, who would later become the first president of Israel, told the Zionist Annual Conference in July 1920, that recognition of our rights in Palestine is embodied in the treaty with Turkey and has become part of international law. This is the most momentous political event in the whole history of our movement. And it is perhaps no exaggeration to say, in the whole history of our people since the exile. The Zionist Organization of America had a similar reaction.
The Zionist Organization of America similarly declared that the decision of the Supreme Council of the Principal Allied Powers, in other words, the San Remo decision, crowned the British Declaration, which is, of course, the Balfour Declaration, by enacting it as part of the law of nations of the world.
Some contend that the intent of the Balfour Declaration, the intent of the decisions of the Allies in San Remo, and then as reflected in the provisions of the Mandate for Palestine, merely meant that a national home would be established in a small component of what was Palestine. This makes no sense. When you look at the discussions between Lloyd George and the other representatives of France and Italy on April 25, and I have the minutes to support this, it's clear that the intent is to give what was on the map, discussed during the meeting, to the Jewish people for their national home.
The Jewish national home was a term, a euphemism that the Zionists themselves used to mean a Jewish state. The British were under no illusion that it meant something else. They knew it meant a Jewish state. This is what Lord Arthur James Balfour himself said when he approved the Balfour Declaration at a cabinet meeting on October 31st, 1917.
The late Howard Grief began practicing law in 1966. For many years, even before that, he had an interest in Middle East affairs. In the 1980s, he began to examine long-hidden documents in the British National Archives that minuted the San Remo Conference of 1920. As a result, he published the book The Legal Foundation and Borders of Israel Under International Law. He also discovered exactly what was the eventual projected outcome for the Jewish national home in the Balfour Declaration.
During the cabinet session of October 31st, Balfour himself said that eventually, if the Jews take advantage of the possibility that they're given and come into Palestine in sufficient numbers, they will have their own Jewish state. This was also approved by the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George.
Minute 12 of the War Cabinet meeting of the 31st of October 1917 records Lord Balfour's intentions as follows. As to the meaning of the words national home, to which the Zionists attached so much importance, he understood it to mean that some sort of British, American or other protectorate under which full facilities would be given to the Jews to work out their own salvation and to build up, by means of education, agriculture and industry, a real centre of national culture and focus of national life. It did not necessarily involve the early establishment of an independent Jewish state, which was a matter of gradual development in accordance with the ordinary laws of political evolution.
So there was no doubt that when the Balfour Declaration was issued, it meant a Jewish state.
However, the idea that the possibility of the Jewish national home becoming a Jewish state was later denied by the British government. One person who played a prominent role in the mandate was Winston Churchill. In 1921, he was appointed Colonial Secretary, which gave him the responsibility of implementing the mandates in the former Ottoman Empire. The 1922 White Paper, which was attributed to Churchill, was in fact largely drafted by Colonial Office official John Shuckburgh, together with the first High Commissioner to Palestine, Sir Herbert Samuel. It contained a phrase that was central to Churchill's belief that the Jews were in Palestine as of right and not by sufferance.
They weren't tolerated for this. It wasn't a gift. It was their right to have the land. And unquestionably, by that point, Churchill believed it. I mean, he already was espousing Zionist views in 1906. He espoused them more strongly in 1908, but then when he went to Palestine in 1921 and saw everything that the Jews in Palestine were achieving in developing the land, and he felt they were also a moderating force and they shared his values. And on top of his belief from before that the Jews, as he put it later, made Jerusalem famous, that this was their land from biblical times, it was their promised land.
From childhood onwards, Winston Churchill was a lifelong friend of the Jewish people, and especially Chaim Weizmann. His father, Randolph Churchill, had been a friend of Britain's first Jewish Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, which left a lifelong impression on Winston as a young man. British historian Andrew Roberts empathises with Churchill's deep respect for the role of the Jewish people in Western civilization.
I think as an historian, I would describe the role that the Jewish people have played for Western civilization in very much the same terms as Winston Churchill did in 1920. He said that the Jews have given us a system of ethics that is in effect the most important possession that Western civilization has. I'd very much go along with that. The Judeo side of the Judeo-Christian tradition, obviously predating the Christian tradition, is something that we live by, and without the Jews we would not have.
What he saw in Palestine in the early 20s convinced him that the Zionists were partners with him in the advance of civilization. He was in no hurry to have a Jewish state in the 20s. He thought when the demographic balance was in the Jews' favor, then it should become a Jewish state.
However, Winston Churchill, as colonial secretary in the early 1920s, is probably best remembered for the division of Palestine before the mandate was ratified. Following the Cairo Peace Conference of March 1921, Churchill was under pressure to fulfill the aspirations of Emir Faisal and his brother Abdullah. As a result, he drew a line down the Jordan River, and 77% of Palestine was designated for Arab settlement exclusively.
In 1921, Faisal, which was Hussein's son, who was supposed to get Syria, was having a lot of friction with the French, who had the mandate of Syria. Churchill agreed to, based on recommendations by his staff, was to give Abdullah to rule over what is today Jordan. Chaim Weizmann was very angry about it, that Churchill made this decision without consulting him or any other Zionist leaders.
The decision was made by the British in 1921 at a time when they had no right by themselves to do this. But it was subsequently endorsed and adopted in 1922 by the Council of the League of Nations. An Arab state was also created and established within the boundaries of what was described as Palestine. So in this day and age, when we talk about the establishment of a Palestinian state in what is referred to as the West Bank, it's really the creation of an Arab state. Palestinians are Arabs. This would be, in fact, the creation of a second Arab state, since one was created in 1922.
During July 1922, the British Parliament debated and finally approved what was known as the Churchill White Paper, and then the draft of the mandate for Palestine was confirmed by the Council of the League of Nations and was approved on July 24th. The preamble to the mandate document incorporated the wording of the Balfour Declaration. Another foundational clause in the preamble states, whereas recognition has thereby been given to the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and to the grounds for reconstituting their national home in that country.
The mandate is based upon the Balfour Declaration, and that declaration has been incorporated by reference at least in 3 places. It's been incorporated specifically in the San Remo resolutions, which established that Britain was to take the mandate. It has been referred to in the Treaty of Sèvres between the Allied powers and Turkey as to the disposition of the Ottoman territories, and it was specifically referred to and incorporated by reference into the Palestine Mandate.
The information that I've received, the documents I've looked at, indicate that the preamble, which specified what rights the Jews would receive and the recognition of their historical connection and right to reconstitute what they used to have, was drafted by Lord Balfour. Fascinating. Not only was he connected, of course, to the Declaration in 1917, not only was he in Paris on February 27, 1919, when the Jews presented their claim, but he was the one who drafted the preamble, which makes it very clear the extent to which their demands have been accepted and recognized.
In formulating legally binding instruments, there was a recognition of the cultural, historic roots of the Jewish people in that land. That it was more than just a legal decision, it was based in the cultural heritage of the Jewish people.
They are recognizing a pre-existing right and not creating a new right. In other words, the historical rights of the Jewish people to this land were recognized by the great powers at the time, by the equivalent of the UN at the time.
Which means that if they can establish that they had a vibrant community in Jerusalem, or in Hebron, or in Shiloh, and in different areas of the Holy Land, they've been given the right to reconstitute these communities. The key to Article 2 is the decree, the enactment of the policy of the Balfour Declaration. It becomes part of international law.
Article 2 of the mandate states, the mandatory, that is Great Britain, shall be responsible for placing the country under such political, administrative, and economic conditions as will secure the Jewish national home.
The Mandate of Palestine was quite specific about who was the beneficiary of this right of self-determination. The preamble to the mandate tells us that the mandate was created in order to reconstitute the Jewish homeland on its ancient land. If you read through the mandate, you'll see there are a number of provisions that were designed to guarantee that. The mandatory authorities, the British, were supposed to cooperate with the Jewish agency in running the mandate. They were supposed to encourage and facilitate the acquisition of citizenship by Jews, immigration by Jews, close settlement of Jews on the land. So there are all these provisions that show us that it was a mandate designed to guarantee the self-determination of the Jewish people.
The whole idea of the mandate was for the Jews to be given the right to immigrate so that the population could increase, so that while the trust is ongoing, they would be stronger, more numerous, and then could declare the independence of their country. That was a whole strategy.
It's worth noting here that the mandate does not name any other ethnic group or any other peoples than the Jewish people as far as obtaining through the mandate political authority over this territory. It does mention the non-Jewish communities and does preserve for them, by the language of the mandate, their civil and religious rights, but all the political rights were reserved to the Jewish people.
Now, later in the administration of the mandate, Britain decided that that proviso was to be weighed equally with the main objective, which was to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Now, when I look at the words without prejudice, they are clearly subordinate to the main clause. If they were to be equal, then it would have said the purpose of the mandate is the establishment of the mandate for the homeland of Jews and the advancement of the Jews and the Arabs. They didn't say that. The mandate does not even mention Arab, it mentions non-Jewish communities. Consequently, I interpret this very much in the same way as the Ottomans looked at the millet system for the non-Islamic communities to whom they gave a certain degree of self-government and security for their religious interests. Similarly, the Jews, if and when they were to become the majority population, are obliged to recognize the civil and religious rights of, again, non-Jewish communities such as Islam, such as Baha'i, Christian, and others.
I want to underline that the primary objective of the mandate for Palestine was to grant political rights in respect to Palestine to the Jewish people. It was applied in favor of the Arabs in the area of Mesopotamia, in the area known as Syria and Lebanon. But in Palestine, the political rights of self-determination was exercised in favor of the Jewish people. As we turn to Jerusalem, it's important to understand the centrality of Jerusalem in Jewish history and Judaism in order to understand how one can reconstitute what these Jewish people used to have.
So by 1922, there were 3 mandates for the purpose of forming 4 Arab nations, all of which had gained their independence by 1946. And so the agreement that Chaim Weizmann made with Emir Faisal back in 1919 was entirely fulfilled. However, the agreement was quickly abandoned by the Arabs.
As more original Zionist Jews were moving to Palestine and they're buying land and then starting to work on agriculture, and they're tilling the fields and turning swamp and so on into arable land. There are people from the surrounding region who start going in to get jobs as laborers in the fields, because the Jews are doing what the Arabs were never able to do, which is really run a very successful agricultural society. And in the meantime, you have, of course, those who are already resisting the Jewish presence. So they start in Hebron in 1929, carrying out small massacres and so on. So there's that unhappiness. It is developing.
Move to 1930, the time of the Passfield White Paper. Restrictions start to be imposed. After so many years of conflict between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, Britain starts to turn her back on the Jewish people, starts to diminish the rights that were already given in the mandate for Palestine, contrary to their obligations as mandatory.
Early on, the British mandate over Palestine had started to run into serious trouble with a series of Muslim Arab uprisings under the leadership of Hajj Amin al-Husseini. The British had appointed this radical Islamist as Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. His appointment was an act of appeasement, a policy that the British authorities thought would restore calm. A pattern had been set that would haunt the rest of British rule over Palestine. By the mid-1930s, Palestine had become almost ungovernable. By this time, Adolf Hitler was in power and the persecution of Jews in Germany had begun. In order to appease the Mufti and his followers, in case they sided with the Nazis, which they ended up doing anyway, the British government began to introduce measures to seriously restrict Jewish immigration into Palestine. The end result was the infamous MacDonald White Paper of May 1939. This White Paper would have disastrous consequences for the Jewish people. It came at a time when Jews in Europe were fleeing from the Nazis, and virtually no country would take them. The White Paper restricted the number of Jews that would be allowed to settle in Palestine to a total of just 75,000 over the next 5 years. Moreover, after that 5-year period, any further Jewish immigration would only be permitted if the Arabs agreed to it. Clause 14.1 of this White Paper also indicated that the Jewish population should not exceed 1/3 of the total population of Palestine. With a 2/3 Arab majority, many of them hostile to the Jewish presence, the political rights of the Jewish people were completely compromised.
The mandate with its sacred trust was meant to create a national home for the Jewish people and to foster their return to their sacred land. And the White Paper, the 1939 White Paper, really was a betrayal of that trust.
In that White Paper, it purported to limit the Jewish immigration to a specific number of persons per year, up to a maximum of 75,000, I believe. And thereafter, no further immigration would be permitted without the Arabs' agreement. Now, that is completely contrary to the mandate.
Great Britain does this without the support and approval of the Council of the League of Nations, does this without the support and approval of the Permanent Mandate Commission, which is overseeing their operations in Palestine.
In addition, the British government also purported to prohibit the transfer of land, further land, to any Jewish institutions. And again, that would be contrary to Article 6 of the mandate. Now, I see that that is completely illegal, and insofar as it had any effect, even the Mandates Commission agreed, on a split vote, I must admit, agreed that it was contrary to the mandate. The mandate itself didn't have direct operative effect in Palestine legislatively. It had to be supported by an order in council, which was passed by the King in Council in 1922. And Article 18 states specifically that the Palestine legislature has full powers of legislation subject to the constraints contained within the mandate. Britain specifically amended its order in council and deleted Article 18, subparagraph 2, which stated that the legislature could not enact legislation contrary to the mandate. So in effect, Britain, in the order of council, said to the Palestine government at the time, you may legislate virtually anything, even if it's contrary to the mandate. So the fact that Britain deleted that clause, 18 subparagraph 2, indicates that Britain herself recognized that she was acting contrary to the mandate.
As an international lawyer, I can say this: there's absolutely no doubt that when Great Britain decided to introduce the White Paper and make it part of the law, it violated the material obligations imposed upon it by the Mandate for Palestine. It was not only shameful, but it was wrong in law. As a result, hundreds of thousands of Jewish people who could have escaped Europe, who could have survived, are stuck in Europe and end up in the death camps.
During the second half of May in 1939, a furious debate over the White Paper took place in the House of Commons. One of its fiercest opponents was Winston Churchill.
After the period of 5 years, no further immigration will be permitted unless the Arabs of Palestine are prepared to acquiesce to it. Now there is the breach. There is the violation of the pledge. There is the abandonment of the Balfour Declaration. There is the end of the vision, of the hope, of the dream.
It effectively meant the end of the Zionist experiment, because if you're going to limit the immigration, you can't have a viable state. Effectively, it was an abrogation of Britain's commitment, legal commitment, internationally legal commitment to the Jews in a Jewish state. That's what the White Paper was.
Dr. Michael Makowski is President and Chief Executive of the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs in Washington, D.C. He is also the author of a biography of Winston Churchill featuring his lifelong sympathy for the Zionist cause. His book is entitled Churchill's Promised Land.
He not only led the charge against the government, but he led the charge against the government which was headed by his own party. By abrogating Britain's commitment through that White Paper to the Jews that had been there for over 20 years, Britain was demonstrating a tremendous amount of weakness. And one, it was wrong on its merits. Two, it undercut everything he built up when he was colonial secretary in the 20s. But most importantly for him was strategically, it marked a big defeat for England. He thought it would invite aggression and also dissuade potential allies of supporting England against Germany. Of course, he was right about that.
Barely 3 months after Parliament's approval of the White Paper, Britain was at war with Germany once again. A year after the White Paper, Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain.
When he became Prime Minister in May 1940, when Chamberlain resigned after the obvious failure of his government in confronting the Nazis, he headed a coalition government with the Labour Party. Now, the Labour Party had been against the 39 White Paper. There were also a number of conservatives, like Churchill, who were against the 39 White Paper. But you had conservatives that were still trying to tighten immigration and enforce this White Paper. And he didn't like that either. So his policy was status quo. The most important issue for him was winning World War II against defeating the Nazis. That was the most important. He made that abundantly clear on at a lot of instances.
It's a tragic, tragic part of the story. As much as one must recognize the crucial role, the vital role played by the British people in helping the Zionist movement move forward, the decisions made by certain leaders in 1939 had devastating effects on many, many hundreds of thousands of Jews who could have been in Palestine instead of concentration camps.
This is the British-built detention camp at Athlete, where many thousands of so-called illegal immigrants were imprisoned. But under the terms of the mandate, which was a binding instrument in international law, they weren't illegal at all. They had every right to be in Palestine. Instead, they were incarcerated here in conditions resonant of Nazi concentration camps in Europe. Many were even transported here in railway wagons, similar to those used by the Nazis. At least here, they were treated less inhumanely. This place was a temporary home for thousands upon thousands of Jewish refugees during the last 10 years of British rule over Palestine. Many were shipped onto other British prison camps in places such as Mauritius, in the Indian Ocean, or later, Cyprus. Another tragic aspect to this story is the fact that by the end of the war, 6 years after the 1939 White Paper, less than half of the quota of 75,000 Jews had actually been admitted to their historic homeland in Palestine. A mere 36,000 immigration certificates had been issued. Meanwhile, in Europe, at least 6 million Jews had been slaughtered by the Nazis and their collaborators. After the war, Britain did extend the 5-year term of the White Paper until the end of 1945, when the quota of 75,000 was fulfilled. But it was too little, too late. In Europe, Hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, many of whom had lost all of their family members and their property, were now homeless refugees with nowhere to go. The end of World War II also saw the dissolution of the League of Nations. It was superseded with the formation of the United Nations in 1945.
The Charter of the United Nations, which you are now signing, is a solid structure upon which we can build for a better world.
How did the dissolution of the League of Nations and the formation of the United Nations affect the rights of the Jewish people under international law?
I want to turn to a final resolution of the Assembly of the League, which was adopted in April 17, 1946, at a time when the United Nations had already been established. And it's important to note these words, that the leaders of the League of Nations stipulate that those who take over must continue to administer the mandates for the well-being and development of the peoples concerned, in accordance with the obligations contained in the mandates. It means that when the United Nations, the new international organization, is established and begins to deal with issues arising out of the mandates, it must abide by the principles, by the rights, by the obligations set out in these mandates. In fact, Article 80 of the UN Charter, which is an international treaty, which is a source of rights and obligations, specifies that all of the rights given to any people prior to the execution and ratification of the UN Charter are to be protected, observed, and honored.
Article 80 of the UN Charter assumes the powers that were given to the League of Nations, so that anything that was decided under the League of Nations, such as the San Remo resolution, such as the mandate for Palestine, are still legally binding under the UN Charter.
In the aftermath of World War II, the overwhelming majority of the hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees in Europe who had survived Auschwitz and the other death camps wanted just one thing: to return to their ancestral homeland in what was then known as Palestine. But the British government, contrary to the terms of the mandate she had signed up to in 1922, kept the doors of what had been designated under international law as the Jewish homeland firmly closed.
In 1945, especially after the elections in England, and when the Labour came to power and Bevin was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, all of a sudden they decided in a very drastic way, in a very cruel way, they stopped any immigration of the Jews from Europe who had nowhere to go. And because after the war, they had nowhere to go, and they did not want to go to the places that all their families have been exterminated. And the only place that would receive them was here in Palestine. But somehow the British Navy was opposing these miserable refugees who came from Europe. Then it became clear to us that we have to face the wars. And this is actually what happened.
The Holocaust survivors tried to reach their ancestral home in every way possible, mostly in small, unseaworthy vessels like the one behind me. This is a memorial to more than 3,000 of them who drowned making that perilous journey. 768 people died on one boat in early 1942, the Struma, having fled from Nazi-occupied Europe. One person survived. Many others also drowned while trying to run the British naval blockade of their promised homeland. Those who did make it were imprisoned in detention camps, either here in Atlit or on the island of Cyprus, by the very nation who had been mandated to recreate a national home for the Jewish people and to encourage their immigration. Then in July 1947, something happened that would publicly expose the plight of these homeless Jewish refugees, the Exodus incident.
Out of Palestine comes the camera story of the Exodus, the Jewish immigrant ship that highlights new violence in the Holy Land.
The British government sent its 4,500 Holocaust survivors back to Europe to be imprisoned again in displaced persons camps in the very country they were fleeing from, Germany.
4,000 Jews are once more back in the hated and dreaded country from which many of them began their long, desperate trip to Palestine.
Many nations around the world, and especially the United States, called for the end of Britain's trusteeship of the mandate. The late Yossi Harel was the commander of the Exodus operation in July 1947.
Many people connected that the ship, the state really was born when the Exodus came to Haifa and was the center of the fight to bring any Jew who wanted to come to Israel, and the reaction of the world opinion. They saw the injustice which was done to people who survived Auschwitz. They don't have a place in this world. The only place which we believed we can have was Palestine.
It just so happened that members of the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine were present at Haifa port when the Exodus arrived. What they witnessed was the catalyst that brought about the historic Resolution 181 at the UN General Assembly on the 29th of November 1947.
Soviet Union, yes. United Kingdom, abstain. The United States, yes.
The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
It is often claimed that this historic vote not only gave legitimacy to the State of Israel in international law, but also to the Palestinian Arabs for their own state as well. Is this the case?
The answer is no. Generally speaking, in international law, General Assembly resolutions are not binding. If the Jewish people and the Arabs had agreed to enter into a treaty based on the terms of resolution, then rights and obligations could have been created in international law. But that didn't happen.
The State of Israel was not created by the United Nations. This is a kind of misunderstanding. People tend to think that somehow Israel was created as a result of the partition plan. When the State of Israel was created on the 14th of May 1948, it was created or established on the basis of preceding legal situations. And those were the San Remo resolution, which was incorporated into the mandate for Palestine, which then transported itself or became the State of Israel. And we know that Article 80 of the UN Charter protects and preserves all pre-existing rights of peoples prior to 1945, when the UN was created. And we know that that applies to the situation in Palestine.
The fact that the United Nations General Assembly recommended that the mandate for Palestine be split and partitioned does not change matters, because that was just a recommendation. The United Nations General Assembly does not have the authority to change the borders of countries, make rules of international law, or do anything else of substance. And in any case, the recommendation that it made in 1947 to partition the mandate for Palestine was not adopted by the British.
I want to make it clear that today, the Arab people, more specifically the Palestinians, do not have any rights or entitlements as a result of the partition resolution, which was presented in November, on November 29, 1947. The very resolution that they rejected, that they refused to accept, was a recommendation of the General Assembly
not a binding document in international law.
The Arab rejection of Resolution 181 precludes the Arabs from any legal claim they might otherwise have to that territory. And moreover, the Arabs have actually not even recognized the right of the Jewish people to have a sovereign state.
Not only did the Arabs reject Resolution 181 out of hand, but the very day after it was carried, they resorted to armed conflict against the Palestinian Jews. The aim? To try to thwart the possible emergence of any Jewish nation and to make Resolution 181 null and void. Nevertheless, the vote was passed with the required 2/3 majority, despite the abstention of the mandatory power Great Britain, who by this time had given notice that they were going to relinquish their stewardship of the mandate. What were the intentions of the British government?
Britain went to the United Nations hoping that they will decide that the whole country will be given to the Arabs, to King Abdullah from Jordan, because King Abdullah was, his chief of staff, John Glab Pasha, he was a British officer. Then the Jordanian army will take all of Palestine, and King Abdullah with his chief of staff, with the British chief of staff, will rule the whole of Palestine.
Following Resolution 181 in the United Nations General Assembly, the declaration of a Jewish state in Palestine looked pretty certain. However, the surrounding Arab countries swore that they would invade and destroy an independent Jewish state as soon as it was declared. Any international lawyer will tell you that such an aggressive invasion is illegal under international law. Some years earlier, the British government had sent Field Marshal Viscount Montgomery to Palestine to assess their chances of survival in the event of an invasion by the surrounding Arab armies. Montgomery's assessment was that the Jewish state would last no more than 3 weeks. Instead of helping the Jewish community of Palestine to defend itself, Britain had imposed an arms embargo on the Jewish fighting forces, while at the same time arming and training the armies of Egypt and Jordan.
Even before 1947, you had the Iraqi Prime Minister calling for jihad against the Jews in Palestine. Once 1947 happens, almost everybody is doing it, not calling for war, they're calling for jihad by the name jihad. King Farouk of Egypt and his foreign minister, a whole bunch of others in Jordan and elsewhere, are all stating this is a jihad war, we're going to fight against the Jews.
On the 14th of May 1948, Britain withdrew its forces from Palestine, thus ending its administration as the mandatory power. Later that same day, David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel in this very hall. It was the most momentous event in 2,000 years of Jewish history.
You are listening to the voice of David Ben-Gurion, proclaiming the independence of the State of Israel.
לפיכך נתכנסנו, אנו חברי מועצת העם, נציגי היישוב העברי והתנועה הציונית, ביום סיום המנדט הבריטי.
By virtue of the natural and historic right of the Jewish people and of the resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations, we hereby proclaim the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine to be called Medinat Yisrael, the State of Israel.
מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל היא מדינת ישראל.
And so the Jewish nation was reborn in the homeland from which it had been expelled nearly 19 centuries earlier. The commitment made to the Jewish people in the Balfour Declaration had eventually come to fruition. Sadly, in the end, The rebirth of the Jewish nation happened in spite of Britain rather than because of us. And even then it was only in a fraction of the territory allotted to them at the San Remo Conference. The other mandates that came out of the San Remo Conference of 1920 successfully gave birth to 4 Arab nations: Iraq and Jordan, also under the British, and Syria and Lebanon under the French. But when it came to the mandate for Palestine, it was a different story. Following a continual policy of appeasement of Arab demands in the final years of the mandate, the British government did everything it could to obstruct the emergence of a Jewish state. Britain actually forsook its sacred trust of civilization towards the Jewish people, and from a legal perspective, violated the terms of the mandate it had signed up to on almost every single level. Indeed, the British government refused to even recognize Israel as a sovereign state for several months after David Ben-Gurion gave his historic declaration here in this hall. The very day after Ben-Gurion's Declaration of Independence, 5 Arab armies invaded the Jewish state and attempted to annihilate it. That attempt failed. Nevertheless, 7 decades later, the State of Israel continues to live under the constant threat of war, and its legitimacy, and even its very existence, continues to be challenged.
The name Palestine was adopted by the non-Jewish Palestinians, and they say, we are the true Palestinians. We belong in the land. We are the indigenous people. And these Jews came in later and created this colonial thing called Israel.
The problem is not land, and the problem is not Israel. The problem is our essence as Jews.
I don't think that there is an interest of the Palestinian leader to solve the conflict.
نحيي كل ذرة دم أريقت في سبيل القدس، فهي دماء نظيفة، دماء نقية، دماء في سبيل الله إن شاء الله.
What Israel has had to do is effectively just give. And we've seen this for so long now that it seems to me to be an obvious part of Palestinian diplomacy. They just take.
70 years ago, the United States was proud to be the first nation in the world to recognize the State of Israel. The United States of America will finally acknowledge Jerusalem is Israel's capital.